This year, I came to the most disturbing realization in my medical practice. There's a silent epidemic that I noticed in my practice. And this happened when I was auditing my chart for the year. And I noticed that 3 out of 4 of my patients came in with symptoms or complications from this silent epidemic. And this epidemic is called insulin resistance. Can you imagine 75% of the patients that I see have this condition? And the worst part is that they didn't even know that the conditions that they were dealing with stem from insulin resistance. And so this year, the focus of my channel is going to be on educating you on what insulin resistance is, all the steps that you need to take to reverse it, and everything in between when it comes to insulin resistance. So stay tuned for the rest of the video. Today, we're going to be talking about what insulin resistance is and what causes it. So, before we can talk about insulin resistance and what it is, we first need to know what insulin is and how it works. Okay. So, insulin is a hormone that is produced by your pancreas, and insulin's primary job is to regulate how much glucose is in your bloodstream. And this is important because if you have high levels of glucose in your bloodstream, it's going to be toxic to your body. It's toxic to your brain, your heart, your blood vessels, your nerves, your entire body. And so it is not okay for your body to have high levels of glucose in your bloodstreams, hence why our body has insulin. So that's the primary job. There is a secondary job of insulin, which is whenever it has energy, it either has to decide whether the energy is used or if it's stored as fat. And we can talk about that completely later in another video because that has to do with fat loss and things like that. But today we're just going to focus on insulin resistance and what it is, okay? So now we know that insulin, its job is to go into the bloodstreams and make sure that the sugar levels in your blood are at a normal range and not toxic, okay? We don't want hyperglycemia. Now, what is going to determine how much insulin comes into the bloodstream? Well, that's going to be determined by what you eat. Okay, so there's different types of foods or macronutrients that we eat. We have proteins, we have fats, and we have carbohydrates. Okay, now the things that make our insulin levels go up is usually simple carbohydrates or sugars. Okay, so candies, cookies, white meal like foods like pasta, things like that, that will increase your insulin levels because what's going to happen is those foods are high in carbohydrates. Your body is going to break those down into sugars, thus leading to hyperglycemia, which your body doesn't want. And so it's going to say, hey, insulin, come in and break this down and get rid of this so it's not in your blood. Okay, so that's the function of insulin. All right, so what then happens when you have insulin resistance? So if you eat meals that are very, very high in carbohydrates, or if you eat sugary foods and you do it quite frequently, then your body is going to consistently have to bring insulin in to manage this high glucose content in your bloodstream. So let's take the example of you eating 5 meals a day and snacking, for example, and you snack on a cookie, you have some ice cream, you have a big bowl of pasta, you have a bagel for breakfast. All of those things seem like normal foods, but they're all very high in carbohydrates and simple sugars. And so if you do that 5 times a day, then insulin needs to come into your bloodstream 5 times a day to try to regulate your sugar, because you're not only eating foods that are bringing in a lot of sugar, you're causing a lot of stress on your body, aka insulin, because it needs to come in all the time and do the work to get your blood sugar to be normal. Now, that's just one day, right? Let's say you do this consistently over a period of months and years. Now, insulin has been working really hard every day trying to bring your blood sugars down. And at some point, there are these things called insulin receptors that, listen to insulin. When insulin says, hey, I need you to break down this sugar, it's going to say, okay, I hear you. I'll break down the sugar, right? But if insulin is always in there, those receptors get tired. Okay, they're like, you know what, I don't want to deal with the sugar thing anymore. And so what happens is at some point, and it could be in your teen years, or it could be in your 20s or in your 30s. Again, it depends on your nutrition and all of that. But at some point, your insulin receptors are going to be tired. Okay, they're going to get weak, and they're going to be like, insulin's always out here playing. I don't think it means business. I don't need to do nothing about this. Okay, so now your insulin levels are going higher and higher and higher, trying to deal with this high sugar, high carbohydrate content that we're constantly putting into our system, and the insulin receptor is not working. And so, if the insulin receptor is not working, then that means that you're going to have hyperglycemia in your bloodstreams, right? Which is what we don't want. Okay. And that is eventually going to lead to diabetes. And so, insulin resistance happens when the insulin receptors are weak and they stop working because your body is producing so much insulin to deal with the high sugar levels in your bloodstream. And earlier on, I had mentioned that, insulin has two jobs. It can either break down your sugars into energy, or it can store it as fat. And so a lot of times, one of the ways that insulin is going to compensate for this high sugar is that it's going to take this glucose that's in your body and it's going to store it as fat. And that comes with its own complications as well. I hope that's a simple explanation of what insulin resistance is. To simplify, it's basically what happens when the receptors that respond to insulin get weak and tired because of the high insulin levels in your body. And the high insulin levels in your body are because you have high glucose in your body. And the high glucose in your body is because you're eating foods that are high in simple sugars or simple carbohydrates that make your body produce so much insulin to try to combat it. But the receptors get tired of seeing insulin all the time, so they decide to start working. And when they decide to start working, we now have to deal with the complications of hyperglycemia and increased storage of fat in the body. So we can talk about that in another video. Now, in my next video, I will talk about some of the signs and symptoms that I see in my office that indicate to me that someone might have insulin resistance. And most of you probably know this. I'll give you a little preview. So, the first and most common reason why patients come into my office is because they have facial hair or hirsutism. And sometimes this is associated with PCOS or polycystic ovarian syndrome, and sometimes it is not. And we'll talk about the difference between the two. But facial hair in women is a very common reason why patients come into my office, and almost always those patients have insulin resistance. So that's number one. Number two, patients come in because they have darkening or hyperpigmentation in certain areas of the body that they want to lighten. Usually it's the neck, it's the underarms, and it's the groin area. This condition is called acanthosis nigricans. It is also a warning, a sign of prediabetes or insulin resistance. I also see patients who come in for skin tag removal. That is an indication of insulin resistance. I have patients who come in with really bad acne, and a lot of times acne is associated with insulin resistance. And lastly, one of the ones that's very tricky, but some patients come in with a condition called keratosis pilaris or chicken skin, and that is also associated with insulin resistance. And so I have to do a lot of education in the office explaining to patients that all of these things are warning signs that your insulin levels are high and your receptors are getting tired, and you're going to have complications of hyperglycemia and increased storage of fat in your body. Okay, so that's what we're going to focus on the next video. So stay tuned. And if you're in the DC metro area and you're looking for a physician who can help you with insulin resistance and complications from insulin resistance, then I'll put my information in the bottom. I will be focusing solely on insulin resistance this year, educating you guys. So if you want to hear more information, or you want to get maybe a newsletter prior to everybody getting the videos, then I suggest that you sign up for my newsletter. I will be talking about insulin resistance and how it relates to skin, health, how to lose weight, all of that. That will be my focus for this year. So make sure that you join the newsletter, and I will see you on the next video. Bye.